guys, Richard Holder here, and welcome to the channel. Here's the question. Which motor offers more bang for the buck? The original 5-liter OG Fox chassis motor or a modern Coyote? I know what you're thinking, Richard, have you lost your mind? There's no way a Coyote is more affordable than a 5-liter Mustang. But hear me out. What would it take to modify the original OG 5-liter Mustang and the Fox chassis to get it to even equal the power output of a modern Coyote? I mean, can it even do that? What heads, cam, and intake would you need to push the power output of a stock motor up to make power like a modern Coyote? That makes a Coyote much more affordable. And then the second question is, what happens if we do the same thing to a 5-liter Coyote? What happens if we add heads, cam, and intake to the modern motor? How much more power does that combination make than the modified original 5-liter? Lots of cool stuff to look at. Let's check it out. To illustrate how far we've come from the original fuel-injected 5-liter Ford to the modern Coyote version, and actually we're not even looking at the most modern Coyote version, which makes even more power, but I digress. Let's take a look and see what it takes to make the kind of power that a modern Coyote makes from a 5-liter Mustang, and we'll see if maybe the Coyote actually isn't a relatively decent bang for the buck compared to a modified 5-liter Ford. So we'll step right in here, and this is our this is basically a typical junkyard 5-liter motor. The way that we run it on the engine dyno, we run it with a Mazir electric water pump. We run it with, in this case, engine 5/8 long tube headers, and we run it with an open throttle body and the factory 5.0 manifold, and everything else being stock heads, stock camshaft, stock rockers, stock short block, stock, all of that stuff. And so we start off there, and then we'll show you what happens when we modify this version to make even more power. And this is kind of typical. In fact, the modified version is actually even a little better than most of them, but they're all going to be kind of in this range. So run with all of the factory components on our 5-liter. This is kind of what we're looking at. This one made 259 horsepower and 320 foot-pounds of torque. And this is pretty typical. I've run lots and lots of these 5-liter motors, and they're all in the between 250 and 260 horsepower. And you might be wondering, yeah, but Richard, they're only rated at 225. Yes, that's because we run them differently than the factory does. The factory runs them with all the accessories and full exhaust and cats and all the way back, and they run them with a full air intake and air silencer and all that stuff the way that it is in the car, and that's how they rate it. So they rate it in a different configuration than we're running it here, and that's why it makes more power. But here's what happens when we modify this combination, keeping the bottom end stock, basically stock short block, but we change the heads, cam, and intake manifold. And in this case, this combination receives some pretty good stuff. And you can do it. Obviously, there are lots of cylinder heads available and lots of cam profiles and stuff, although you're a little bit limited on camshaft if you retain the stock bottom end, because what happens is that you run out of available piston to valve clearance. So our new combination was a 302 short block. It had a trick flow. It had their stage 2 camshaft, and it was very similar to the Comp Extreme Energy 274. It was a 540/560 lift split, 224, 232 degree duration split, 112 degree load separation angle. This combination was also treated to some very good cylinder heads. They are trick flow 11R heads. They're CNC ported 170cc heads. It also received a matching trick flow street heat, the long runner intake manifold with an AccuFab. It's a 70 or 75 millimeter throttle body. We ran our same hooker headers that says 1 3/4 here, but they're actually 1 5/8. And then we optimized this combination with this new top end package on it, basically. And here's what happened. Equipped with basically a TFS kind of top end package on it, but with the 11R heads instead of the standard twisted wedge. The new combination produced over 400 horsepower, so it did fairly well. 407.5 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 397 foot-pounds, and you can see it basically gained power everywhere. We didn't run it down at 2,500. The 11R heads had small chambers on them, so we improved the static compression just a little bit, and we had a very kind of minimal piston to valve clearance with this combination, but it all worked out very well. What you'll see is on modified 5-liters, they could be around 400 horsepower with other different cylinder heads that are available for the 5-liter. But this gives you a pretty good idea of what happens when you modify a typical 5-liter with, aluminum heads in the right camshaft and a good intake manifold, of which there are a variety available for the 5-liter. So now let's take a look and see what happens and how this kind of compares to a new Coyote. Now that we've taken a look at our 5-liter Ford, this was the stock one, and then this was our modified version of the 5-liter with heads, cam, and intake manifold. Let's check out and see how this compares to basically a bone stock Coyote. In this case, this was a 2010, 2011. We did the test actually in 2010, and I know that people are going to comment about, hey, Richard, they didn't even have a Coyote back then. Well, they did, actually. And so we got a crate motor, and here's what happened. This is a comparison between the modified 5-liter with heads, cam, and intake, and what happens when you just put a stock Coyote up that has long tube headers on it and run it basically in stock configuration. Here's our Coyote version. So this gives you an idea of how far we've come, how far Ford has come. And the new version, the most modern version, 2021 or 2022, that motor makes even more power than this, because this is a very early Gen 1 Coyote. But you can see that equipped with long tube headers and tuned with an optimized tune the way that we did on the 5-liter, the modern 4-cam, 4-valve 5-liter makes a lot more power even than a modified 5-liter, and a pretty good modified 5-liter. I mean, that thing made 407 horsepower, but if you look at it, basically otherwise bone stock Coyote run in the same configuration on the engine dyno without the accessories and air intake, and run with a good exhaust. That combination made 462 horsepower and even made more torque. 411 foot-pounds of torque, a nice broad torque curve, making more low-speed power and much more top-end power than even a modified 5-liter. So if you take a look at from a standpoint that the technology has improved obviously dramatically since the days of the 5-liter, even though we look fondly back at that, and we like the way that they were, obviously the way that they responded to power, upgrades, to performance upgrades, heads, cams, and intake manifolds. You see a modern Coyote, and this isn't even modern, this is even more than a decade old, but even that version was way better than even a modified 5-liter. So it begs the question, how much money would you spend on a typical 302 build versus just getting a stock Coyote? So it makes you think. Now let's take a look and see what happens when we then modify the Coyote version and see how much more power we make doing that. Well, there's no doubt that the Coyote definitely costs more to start out with, especially if you're buying a brand new Coyote, but I'm kind of talking about going to the wrecking yard and finding one. Finding a Coyote and a Mustang when I go to the wrecking yard, I've never seen one. You will occasionally find, and I've only ever found one, in the truck version, so you can get those and they're much less money. You could upgrade them with the cams that guys are taking out of Coyote motors, and you could make them, make really good power. As we saw here, a bone stock Coyote, this one was from a Mustang, makes a lot more than even a modified 5-liter. But what happens when you modify the Coyote? Now, we know it's more expensive to buy cams and heads and all that stuff for the Coyote, but let's take a look and see what happens when you do that and how much extra power you can get from those modifications. So this was our 2010, 2011 Coyote motor, 462 horsepower and 411 foot-pounds of torque. Here's what happened after we started making modifications to it. So we added cams, mild comp cams. I'll go ahead and put the specs up here for the camshafts, and then this also had a JLT cold air intake in place of the factory air intake. Because when we ran this Coyote on the engine dyno, we ran it with the factory mass air meter and stuff, because we ran it with the Ford Racing Controls pack. But you can see right off the bat with cams and the air intake, we're up at 516 horsepower. Then we added a Boss intake and larger throttle body, and you have to decide whether or not the loss and low speed power of it with a Boss kind of short runner intake manifold. But there's no denying that it made good power. We were up in the 540 horsepower range or so. And then here's what happened when we put CNC heads on it. Again, even more power. We're looking at 570 horsepower or so. And then if you want to kind of take a look with the long runner factory intake manifold, you'll gain even more low speed power. So again, you can decide whether or not the short runner stuff at high RPM is the way that you want to go, or you want the extra torque. Because if you take a look at it, 475 foot-pounds of torque with the long runner factory intake. Now, if you were to add the late model Cobra Jet 1 or the Gen 3 intake manifold, you could even make even more power than the factory early one. And so it's a good combination, but it goes to show you with, you know, ported heads and cam and intake on the Coyote, you're looking at, now we got with another set of cams, we got real close to 600 horsepower with this combination. That's certainly possible, and even more so with the latest version of the Coyote. 600 horsepower NA is not a problem at all with a modified Coyote, and that compares to, we were looking at about 400 horsepower on a modified 5-liter. So we have indeed come a long way with the modern Coyote versus the original 5-liter, so that's nothing but a good thing. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do we learn in this comparison between our original OG 5-liter Fox chassis motor to the not-so-modern Coyote? I mean, after all, this was a Gen 1 Coyote and not the later Gen 2 or Gen 3 version that makes a lot more power. But still, it demonstrates how far we've come from the original Fuelie 5-liter to the more modern versions. In fact, the difference is about 200 horsepower. Run on the dyno the way that we do, we see that the original 5-liter made about 250 or 260 horsepower, and that a modern Coyote run in the same trim makes about 460 horsepower. But here's the comparison. What about bang for the buck? Obviously, it's a lot less expensive to buy an original 5-liter, and they're readily available. That's the problem with a Coyote. If I were to go to my wrecking yard and find Coyotes there, it would be the same price as an original 5-liter. But the problem is I can't find them, not in a Mustang and even not in a truck. So if you have to go online to find them, the Coyote is going to be initially more expensive. But here's the thing. As we showed, it takes a lot of modifications to get the OG 5-liter to even approach the power output of a modern Coyote motor. So what is the cost of that modified version of the 5-liter now versus the cost of the initially more expensive Coyote? And then what happened when we modified the Coyote and modified the original 5-liter? Again, we have a difference of about 200 horsepower. That makes the Coyote much more palatable, and I think the Coyote deserves a second look. Armature holder, make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. I'll keep testing.